Hello, my name is Caitlin Bentley, and I'm here with Chisenga Muyoya, and we are in a meeting room at the Information School in the University of Sheffield in the UK. I wish we could be there with you all instead. I'm now a lecturer in AI education at King's College London in the Department of Informatics.
Hello, and I'm Chisenga Muyoya. I'm a co-founder and research director at Ethica Network, a women in tech initiative in Zambia, and I'm a PhD candidate here at the University of Sheffield researching gender data gaps.
So today we're going to be discussing how our research on intersectional approaches to data and whether or not this area might be a way to make algorithms socially responsible in our uncertain futures. In this presentation, we're considering how our research applies within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So we thought we'd begin with a couple of examples. I'm from Canada, and one of my colleagues pointed out a media article about a team of public health researchers and practitioners that had combined health data to show that many COVID-related deaths were not being counted, and most of those deaths were from racialized communities. In the province of British Columbia, mortality rates were 11.2 times higher than white communities. So Iman, one of the contributors of the report, was quoted as saying, "How many more bodies have to drop before our communities deserve equitable healthcare and representation?" And in BC, the health minister, Bonnie Henry, she said that they don't collect racialized health data because they think it will stigmatize these populations. So Iman argues that they need to collect this data to be able to prioritize better. She mentions that other countries collect inclusive data and are better alerted, but spoiler alert, although inclusive data is important, it does not solve systemic injustices that we've witnessed during the COVID pandemic alone. So in the UK, reports by the Office of National Statistics published inequalities in the impact of COVID early into the pandemic, but we also still faced higher death rates in minoritized ethnic populations here as well. And since we're here to talk about the social responsibility of algorithms, I wanted to share another example to illustrate why data and algorithms alone will not necessarily help resolve these injustices, especially in times of crises. So this example is also from Canada. It's about a company created by University of Toronto researcher called Cameron Can. He created a machine learning algorithm that was able to detect COVID-19 before the WHO, before it was even COVID-19. And I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but if you want to read more about it, there's a great chapter in Dr. Susan Omen's book about it. In it, she questions why this algorithm, even if it was so good at detecting the virus, why did it have such little impact on mitigating the spread of the disease or the impact of it on people's lives? So she flips the script on what Iman has said about needing more data, that maybe it's not just about whether we are limited in the data we have to understand these issues, but that maybe we need instead to question what limits for well-being do data projects like these have. And this is really where I think our research comes into play. We argue that intersectionality as a theory and a practice helps us to reorient the creation and use of algorithms with social justice and responsibility outcomes as a main priority.
So what is intersectionality? This is an area of research and practice that has grown from Black feminist thought and influence. It's commonly known as an analytical framework to explain how a person's identity is shaped by multiple aspects of their identity, like their age or gender or ethnicity, and all those come together in a time and place to increase the privilege or discrimination or advantage or disadvantage that they experience. But intersectionality is more than that. We adopt Patricia Hill Collins' view that intersectionality is a theory and a praxis. It's a way of seeing complexity in the world and figuring out what needs to be done to address social justice issues. And we must acknowledge how systems and structures that people and communities are embedded within are also vital to not only to understand, but also to try and to change them. So our work is influenced heavily by Collins, and we adopt her view that intersectionality is a critical inquiry and a praxis. So we turned to the literature. We wanted to see how intersectionality researchers engage with data to learn more about it. In the past few years, more than 2,000 articles have been published, all claiming to adopt an intersectional approach. These articles come from across the social sciences, medicine, humanities, psychology, the arts, etc. At the moment, intersectional approaches are being applied in very diverse ways, with limited methodological discussion and even less about data practice in particular. So initially, we really anticipated that we would learn quite a lot from this diverse scope of literature. We obviously couldn't review all 2,000 articles, so we took a random selection of 200 articles and coded them based on how they handle data and what they use data for. After about 60 or so, many aspects of data practice that we had included were really not being addressed in what we were reading, so we refined our coding to focus on what we could say about data from reviewing these articles. So we decided to focus on data collection and analysis specifically. This resulted in a thematic analysis based on critical data studies and based on the frame that has primarily been informed by Patricia Hill Collins' work. So basically, instead of using this literature to answer the questions we had, we're sort of trying to think more critically and holistically about it. So we thought we'd give a bit of context about the articles we included in our analysis, as it gives us some clues as to what is missing and the limits of our analysis. What is clear is there's been an explosion of intersectionality research in the last 7 years. But the publications we analyzed are highly concentrated in certain regions, mainly the US, which has the majority share. This map shows where the research took place, so where the empirical evidence itself was collected. Obviously, reasons for this are related to long-standing publishing trends and inequality, but it does mean that we shouldn't necessarily assume that intersectionality resonates globally. A positive thing is that there is wide disciplinary scope. The purple bars relate to intersectionality research, and the green ones relate to the disciplines in our sample of articles. I apologize, you can't really read it, but the biggest bar are sources that aren't categorized by JournalSeek. So these are likely to be books or book chapters. Social science is the next biggest bar, and then humanities, medicine, psychology, and education. There are very few in engineering or computer science. This graph shows which combinations of personal characteristics were often included in their analyses. You can see that ethnicity, gender, and class are quite common, but it also shows that there are certain communities that are still underrepresented in the literature base, like indigenous populations or the elderly.
So for us, when we started to analyze our codes thematically, we were, I guess, underwhelmed by essentially the lack of attention to data practice, especially when they're within their explanations of methods, if they had one. We needed to step back and look at our main research questions around what is an intersectional approach to data, and what it would mean to recognize good practices. And we returned to Patricia Hill Collins, and in her book, she has a chapter on relationality, which is really one of the core concepts of intersectionality. She covers a wide breadth of intersectionality, but like power, complexity, social justice. But we're really focusing on relationality because we had narrowed down our codes to data collection and analysis. And the main issues that we were seeing around this was a lack of attention to data, where it comes from, who's producing and using it, and so forth. So Collins proposes that there are 3 ways of thinking about relationality that could extend intersectional theorizing and practice. The first is additive thinking. And this is sort of the most common way that people understand intersectionality, that by adding gender or ethnicity together, it tells us something new or unique. So by this logic, the more that you categorize and classify individuals in different ways, the more that we can combine those categories to generate new insights. For the second frame, it's called articulation. And just briefly, you can think about this in terms of like a connection that links or articulates one or many other pieces together in a whole. So this emphasis is on the ways in which these different pieces can be put together to form wholes. And there's also a discussion around language and reflexivity. So altogether, we find that this is a more systemic or reflexive or holistic way of thinking about relationality, in which you can't or you couldn't really separate data from its contexts or the people working with data or those who data is about. But although this frame is more holistic, Collins argues that it's still quite tied to Western epistemologies and methods. So she suggests that one way of thinking about relationality that abandons categorical thinking is called co-formation. And this is essentially about understanding or theorizing a social phenomena as one thing or process. And in general, in our analysis, we found that most intersectionality research that we examined tended to use Great. So where was I? That most of these articles tended to use the additive thinking frame. However, if we're concerned with the social responsibility of algorithms, we think that potentially the latter two frames might be more useful to unpack in the context of data. And I'll just briefly highlight some of our analysis, specifically on data collection strategies, because we don't have time to cover it all. But one reason that other frames of relationality might be more useful than additive thinking for increasing the social responsibility of algorithms is that there are different data collection strategies that we could see in the literature. There were quite a few articles that focused on understanding lived experience of a particular community based on a set of characteristics and engaging with a representative population of participants. Or they could target unique or missing voices. So where data collection is concerned, issues are around how these categories are defined, along with how many categories should be combined. And then perhaps there's often little reflection around who is doing the data collection or the analysis or even the categorization. Alternatively, we also found it common within quantitative approaches to use the additive thinking frame, but often these quantitative articles are more focused on generalization or making inferences, and they lacked capacity to explain inequality or discrimination more generally. So for data collection, there was also a limited criticality about whether the measures they were using in surveys or so forth, or the categories they used in secondary data were actually appropriate. There were a few good examples of adaptations in data collection strategies, like researchers who used strategies to check their findings with wider communities, debate findings, and so on. And there were also examples of like body mapping or unstructured data collection techniques that showed some promise, but we didn't really find many examples of data collection strategies that could highlight the value of articulation or co-formation frames of relationality.
Yeah. Thanks, Caitlin. So even though we didn't find any stand-up out examples in the literature, we wanted to illustrate how other frames of relationality could be important. So as I mentioned, I work at a Women in Tech initiative in Zambia, but I've also previously worked at a tech hub, so I've run a lot of hackathons over the years. Hackathons are a great way to bring together data enthusiasts, data scientists, and public and private institutions, as well as civil society organizations to address specific societal challenges. So they involve the rapid pitching of ideas, formation of teams, and development of a prototype in a limited time period. So these hackathons typically have a predefined problem and a tech or data deterministic solution. Participants come with specific tools that they are ready to apply, like a programming language such as Python or data visualization tools such as Tableau. So, how do we need to change hackathons in order for them to become a site of co-formation? An example could be a hackathon around real-time COVID mitigation data. The organizers might be primarily concerned with which data sets or which algorithms they should use. But how can this example be more centered around the affected communities? In my community, storytelling is a powerful way of sharing information, even though it's not always considered a valid way of creating rigorous knowledge. So we might start by asking participants to tell stories about their experiences and use those to identify shared concerns. We might then look at the secondary data that's available about those areas of concern and do even more storytelling around the data. We could ask the questions that Caitlin mentioned in the previous slide. Does the secondary data reflect our realities? What is missing from the data? What is included and why is it included? How are those categories created? What other sources could exist that can complement that data and add more depth to it? We should also ask, what other questions could we be asking? So the stories and contributions of participants and the ideas or algorithms that they developed during the hackathon could be more localized and grounded and mutually constructed in a grounded and mutually constructed way to address COVID within our community. But we need more research to understand co-formation better. Now, based on our research findings, we have outlined prompts in a few areas that will enable us to think more critically about intersectional approaches to data, as well as social responsibility of algorithms. These are concerned with time, methods, place, and policy. We found that the issues of timescales is largely unexplored in the area of inclusive and intersectional data. We still don't have answers or a good plan to deal with evolving crises like COVID-19 based on existing intersectional methods. Will better intersectional data infrastructure be enough? We argue that intersectional approaches need more granular and localized data. If more granular and place-based data is needed to address social justice issues, what are the implications for algorithm design, especially machine learning algorithms that require large data sets? How will designers build trust with communities or gain access to this data? With regards to methods, much more can be done to research, debate, and co-design methods to implement intersectionality in data science. The answer is not just more qualitative data or more qualitative analysis. Articulation and co-formation frames of relationality offer new opportunities for investigation. And when it comes to policy, we ask, what does the whole systems approach actually entail? Who will be responsible for the social responsibility of algorithms and the ways in which inclusive data and its infrastructures are used?
Who's responsible for responsibility? Come on. All right. Thank you, everybody.